I'm joined by Tim Moriarty of Castletown Media. Tim, thanks for being with me.
Thanks so much, James. Great to be here.
Thanks, Tim. Tim, tell me a little bit about Castletown Media. What is that and what's your role?
Sure thing. So Castletown Media, we began back around 2017. Um, and the genesis of it was it was kind of organic. I prior to getting involved in, video production and film, I had been a Jesuit for about 3 years and studied philosophy and theology and really thought I was going to be on that track. And then in the course of discernment, kind of felt God was calling me, elsewhere towards, marriage and a life that was not going to be, religious, devoted to him in that form. And that was a kind of painful experience to realize, but it was also humbling to realize, okay, God has a different plan. So in that period, after leaving the Jesuits, I became really interested in the power of art, the ways in which art has been a way that the church has evangelized. So, throughout its history, that's been a way that the gospel has been communicated. In my own family, my dad had been an actor as a younger man, and so I had always been interested in theater and acting, and so I decided to pursue acting. So after leaving the Jesuits, went into to do an MFA in acting, and then spent about 5, 6 years in New York working in that capacity. And while there in New York, I became friendly with the Brooklyn diocese, especially DeSales Media, and had done some things for them in front of camera, but then had really started to feel this desire to try to bring some of the work I had done early on in the Jesuits and some of this interest in theology, sort of behind the camera in terms of storytelling and producing. Um, and there was a story that I came across in Staten Island about Father Vincent Capodanno, who was a Marine Corps chaplain who died in the course of the war. And we decided to do a film without any real experience at film school or anything like that. And it was a tremendous experience to be able to work with people, to do interviews with veterans that knew him. This there was something I thought that was just profound, to have somebody who could share these deep experiences of grace, of pain, of suffering in front of the camera, really revealing the way in which God is working in their life for the sake of communicating something that's true, that's good, that's beautiful, for the sake of, those that would be watching. So that was the first film. That was really the beginning of Castletown Media. And from there, it was really this just, beautiful experience where started working with various clients from, EWTN was an early client, the Knights of Columbus. I've worked with Focus as well, different dioceses and archdioceses around the country. And so Castletown has really been a dual thing where we've been doing, short form videos, but also I think our real passion are these longer feature length documentary projects. So that was sort of the genesis of it. And so since then we've done, probably a dozen different films, some short, some long. And 2022, we had a really just beautiful privilege of working with the Knights of Columbus on their film, Mother Teresa, No Greater Love. Through that experience, had met Jim Wahlberg. And it was an organic thing where Jim had a relationship in the Diocese of Orange with Deacon Steve Greco, and he had a desire to do a film about the Eucharist. So that was kind of, not to get too far ahead of the story, but that was kind of how that relationship developed. So that's a little bit of a snapshot of what Castletown Media, where it came from, and the kind of work that we're doing right now.
Thanks, Tim. Let's talk. Let's stay on the Jesuit ethos for a moment, which is, I think, very fascinating. Did you look into the Jesuit theatrical background that the society was known for back in maybe the 18th century?
Yeah, part of the formation, we would spend a summer in Denver and we would learn about different aspects of Jesuit spirituality and history. And that was something that was really striking, the ways in which the Jesuits incorporated theater. I think that one of the real gifts of Ignatius is he understood the power of the imagination and the ways in which the imagination is a catalyst for transformation. So it made sense to me that doing the spiritual exercises, for instance, it's in a way, there's some similarities to method acting, in that you are engaging the imagination in this profound way, putting yourself in a scene. You're smelling, your senses are engaged. You're seeing, you're hearing, in the gospel scene with Christ in this fully immersive experience in your imagination of what it would be to walk with Christ. And spiritual exercises are organized in 4 weeks where you're really walking with Christ. And the point of this is to really put on Christ, is to be transformed by Christ. And the mechanism by which that happens is through the imagination. So what does an actor do? And if an actor wants to play a character, you create scenes in your imagination which bring about emotional change, which create physical characteristics. And what Ignatius knew, I think, before Stanislavski is, well, we want to be Christ. We want to be transformed into Christ. And so these I don't want to call it a technique because it sort of reduces this prayer experience, this imaginative prayer experience would bring about that transformation. So the ways in which the Jesuits then were always very open to the arts, especially theater, in the way they would train young people, I think comes out of that insight that to really bring about transformation, we have to engage more than just the head. There has to be the imagination. The imagination is this really fertile ground for an encounter with God.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to Jesus Thirst. What was your role? And first of all, how did you get involved? You started mentioning it, and then what was your role in the project?
Sure thing. So yes, I was mentioning the project, the genesis of it all was Deacon Steve Greco. He runs Spirit-Filled Hearts. He's the director of evangelization for the Diocese of Orange. And he had a series of conferences that he led through his organization, and he called them I Thirst conferences. And they were all geared towards really reawakening people to the beauty of the Eucharist. And in some of those, he had brought Jim Wahlberg to speak, and Jim has really an amazing conversion experience. And in the course of those conversations, the idea about creating a film about the Eucharist that could be really a tool for the greater work the church is engaged in with Eucharistic revival, those conversations really took place. This was a year ago, spring of 2023. And because we had struck up this great friendship with Jim after Mother Teresa No Greater Love, Castletown became involved very early in those conversations. So our role was, we were essentially the production company to create the film. I functioned as the director and co-writer of the film with Stefan Slovak, who was also part of Castletown. And for us, I'd say it was a couple things. First off, it was very it was a terrifying project to take on for a couple of reasons. One is the Eucharist is a theological reality. It's not just, some films you do a biography. There's a kind of story that's inherent in a biography where you kind of know what the structure is going to be. Even if it's a non-linear approach, there's a structure in what you're covering. Or if you're doing an event, sort of a historical event, so similar to that in a documentary, you can kind of find the structure in the topic that you're covering. In the Eucharist, it's one of the great mysteries of our faith, and it includes biography in terms of Jesus, in terms of all of the saints who have been transformed by the Eucharist, but yet it's also a theological reality that is pointing to something utterly transcendent, namely the presence of Christ, the real presence of Christ. So it was hard to think through, how do we make a film that could follow us, have a structure? And then the second piece is how do you do justice to that? I mean, anything you do is going to feel very, you're going to fall short of what you're trying to cover. So for us, that was sort of the genesis of it. Those were the first kind of the feeling, or the approach that we took was one of, how do we do this? And I think what that led to was really a need to put it into prayer. It was to say, whatever we do is going to fall short, but let's see what God can do through us. And let's just focus on seeing what would God, how in this period where so many Catholics have lost a sense of the Eucharist in a world that has grown increasingly materialistic, how do we follow the movements of the Holy Spirit to create a film that could try to reawaken something that has grown so numb in us? And that was kind of the genesis of it, and that was sort of the spirit behind it. Was one of prayer, humility, and a sense of, God, can you help us tell this story?
Tell me a little bit about the production. It's a huge scope. So break that down a little bit if you can for us.
Sure. So the first part of it was, in this period where we were just, asking for some guidance on the structure, the road to Emmaus was really the first thing that really just said, okay, this may be our spine. This is the structure. So what do we see in the road to Emmaus? We see the disciples walking away from Jerusalem, utterly in despair, despondent over what all of the hopes that they had in Jesus had been dashed, and they were running away in fear. And Jesus encounters them, and he brings them back into the scriptures. And what happens to them? Their hearts begin to burn within them. And then it's the gospel passage talks about how he breaks the bread and their eyes are opened. So that was sort of the first helpful thing. We thought we needed to follow that same structure. We needed to say, okay, where are we today? Some of the whole impetus for the Eucharistic revival movement was that 2019 Pew Research study, and there have been subsequent studies that have shown maybe the numbers weren't as in terms of Pew Research study in 2019 said that something like 70% of Catholics in the pews don't believe in the real presence. Other studies have shown different numbers, but all of them have shown there's a large number of Catholics who don't understand the church's teaching. So we wanted to, in terms of the structure, be able to start there, that this is a kind of crisis. And then we knew we wanted to go and open up the scriptures. What are the key parts of the Old Testament and the New Testament that can help us understand this mystery? But we also knew that it couldn't be something that was merely catechetical and just engaging the mind. We were really taken by the idea that of the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Starting with beauty was really the first path, the first way into the mystery of the Christian faith. So we wanted the film to be very beautiful. We wanted to shoot it in a certain style. We wanted the interviews to be beautiful. We wanted the cinematography to be of a certain quality. But we also wanted to focus on the good. So we wanted to find stories from around the world, from different communities where we could see tangibly in a really visceral way lives that have been transformed by the Eucharist. So rather than just focusing on, the catechesis of going back to the scriptures, we wanted to weave in stories that could help illustrate some of the mysteries we were talking about. And then through that, the truth of the Eucharist could hopefully make itself present to people. So in terms of the actual production, it was an ambitious project in that Deacon Steve, I think very wisely, wanted the film done this year in time for the Eucharistic revival. So we essentially had maybe 10 months to finish the film. And so there was this sense, and there was a very fast pace to the film. Typically, you could, I think something like this, you'd take a couple of years. For us, it was a fast pace, and so there was a sense of it was all hands on deck, finding the stories that we wanted to tell, giving the sense of the universality of the church, and then sending our crews different parts of the world and stitching it all together. And some things, we had to wait for certain components where we couldn't schedule a certain shoot for a couple months down the road. So we were kind of editing little segments as we went because we knew we just didn't have time to get everything shot. And then we would, weave it all together. In a way, we needed to create the segments as we were going, given the time crunch. And there was some fear in that as well, because ideally you could have the whole piece, all of the footage, and then from there craft it. But for us, it was the sense of, it was almost like Cardinal Newman's phrase, lead kindly light, just one step enough. So we would just focus one step at a time. We knew we had this, we knew this was a beautiful story here, whether it was a missionary in Uganda who would go to a small village, whether it was the story of Cardinal Vantuan, who had this remarkable experience in solitary confinement after the communists took over. We knew we could just focus on each of these stories with great care and great detail, with that overarching structure and outline of where we wanted to go in our mind. And so that was sort of a little bit of just the process that we took. It was it was that sense of one step, and in a way, it was good to be able to focus that way, because as I was mentioning early on, it was a very daunting task, but just to focus on one piece at a time allowed us to try to take great care with each of the segments we were working on.
Tim, what was your impression? I mean, the universality of the church really comes through in the film, but also the inherent beauty of the church, I believe, it comes through. What do you make of that when you were filming and editing?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it struck me profoundly in that, the world has grown a little ugly, you could say, or flat. I mean, I remember, in my own, it was a personal project for me because I remember when the faith really came alive to me. It was in high school before Christ in the Eucharist, and there was this sense of connecting with Christ in the Eucharist where all of reality felt in a way charged with almost a multi-dimensional sort of quality. It's hard to describe, but then there was this sense in which you'd go back into the real world, the real world of science, or the science as scientism, you could say, or materialism, where everything felt somewhat flat. You're bumping into objects, and reality is nothing more than what you can see and sense. I think what was striking to us in creating the film was um, was really encapsulated in what I think Archbishop Fulton Sheen says at the very beginning of the film, where he says, if you were alive at the time of Christ, you would have seen just a man like other men. But if you had the eyes of faith, you would have seen divinity. So that question of perception, how do we help those of us, all of us, whose spiritual senses have grown dull? How do you open those senses up? How do you see the unseen? How do you lead somebody to that act of faith whereby all of a sudden the world opens up? So the film, it was really an attempt to do that through these stories where you can see, even in there was a um, one of the people we interviewed, this old man from Uganda, who talks about being in Eucharistic adoration and having this sense of Christ manifesting himself. And you can see in his face, there's something mysteriously beautiful and peaceful in just the countenance of his face that makes you think, okay, either he's delusional or there's something there, there's something there. Or there was an older Slovenian nun who talks about, what it is to feed on spiritual food, and people who don't have spiritual food, they don't really know what they're missing. So there's that sort of, how do you, in a way, point to something that is beyond what our senses can really, um, beyond what our limited sort of human capacity has the appreciation for, which is the supernatural reality. How can you, through this art form, point to that and at least give people that stirring desire to say, maybe I can how do I get that? How do I experience that? So that was sort of the approach of beauty. I think the universality piece is to say that there is a universal hunger in the human heart for God, for transcendence, for this experience of ultimate love. And it's cross-cultural, it's cross-generational, that we can pretend that we have, outgrown God, but there's something just that is utterly universal in this thirst, this hunger that we all have for Christ. So that was another thing we really wanted to show, that this isn't just a story here in America. This isn't a story. This is a universal human story of our longing for God, and then more importantly, God's deep desire to give himself to us.
Tim, what was your reaction to the film's reception? Were you surprised by the reception of the film?
In a way, yes. In a way, yes, and in a way, no. So I would say, um, it was a shock to us that this film became, the highest grossing documentary of any genre in 2024 in the box office. That was a surprise because it's a very, it's a film about the Eucharist. It's very specific. And we didn't really hold any punches in trying to be very bold in what the church teaches. And there was no attempt, it was an attempt to be, sometimes the church has tried very hard to be relevant. Here this is the church being relevant, and we're trying, this was just saying, this is what we believe. But more so trying to show that reality of what joy and what grace it offers. So the fact that it was a film about the Eucharist that resonated so deeply was a surprise, in that you wouldn't think that, you look at the list of the highest grossing films this year, to have a film about the Eucharist was peculiar. At the same time, because of this deep desire that we're kind of witnessing in the culture for something more than the culture is offering, it, in a way, it makes sense that there is a deep hunger out there. And also I kind of think that the Catholic world is, we've gone through a lot of struggle, a lot of pain. I myself, had uh, I spent maybe 8 years or so where I just took a step back after the abuse crisis. There was an older member of my family that had a memory of something that had taken place. And I understand how deeply impacted Catholics in the pews, but also those that have left, have felt about just the struggle that the church has faced, and looking at statistics and feeling this sense of despair of that, what's happening. But at the same time, what the alternatives that are out there and the different things that people have been trying to fill that void are really not working. And I think we're seeing a real different thing happening. The age of the new atheist movement of the 90s and the 2000s, that has given way to something where there's a space that's opening up for deep conversations again about faith. So the fact that this film was maybe hitting a nerve for those people that are hungry for this, it's not surprising. There was calls that I had from people who left, who were weeping, were moved by what something they experienced. They'd been away from the church for maybe 10 years, and they said, well, there's something in this that touched me. And there were different things for different people, but something that stirred that longing. So in that sense, it wasn't surprising that it has resonated so deeply. I think it just shows that we're in a different cultural moment where I think we can stop being as bashful and ashamed to talk about our faith, because I think people desperately are longing for truth, for beauty, for goodness. And insofar as this film, in some way is was something where we allowed God to work through us. I think that's why it has resonated so much.
Tim, what are you working on right now then?
Yeah, so right now we're working. It's very exciting. We're working on another documentary film about Blessed Carlo Acutis, soon to be Saint Carlo Acutis, the first millennial saint. And one of the things we're doing there is, Jesus Thirsts is a film that is, it's really a film that is there to stir the hearts of all people, but especially Catholics that are still in the pews, but maybe their hearts have grown a little lukewarm, and there's a sense in which this film could help regenerate or revive that faith. With Blessed Carlo, this film is called Roadmap to Reality. One of the things we want to do is, we are in a crisis right now with young people. You look at some of the statistics with Generation Z. There has been a kind of epidemic of mental illness, and I think it really is. It relates to the amount of screen time. This whole living in a kind of virtual world whereby friendship, genuine personal connection has fallen to the wayside, as more and more people are finding themselves with virtual friends, comparing themselves to each other on social media. I was looking at some stats from the CDC recently, and something like 40% of Generation Z have diagnosed mental illness. Almost 20% have a suicide plan, or they've contemplated suicide. It's really terrifying. So what we're doing with the film here on Carlo is we want to look at Carlo's life, this young man, the first millennial saint, the holiness that he lived, but more so we want to look at the culture through Carlo's eyes in a way that can help young people see through a lot of the lies that they've been given, to how do I get in touch with the reality, ultimate reality, which is God, and how is Carlo a kind of roadmap for navigating these strange waters that we are living in. And one of the things that's remarkable about Carlo is, yeah, he was they call him the first digital saint and all this, but he was very moderate in his use of these technologies. His mother said, "Oh, yeah, he liked video games, but he only allowed himself 1 hour a week on video games because he understood how addictive they were." Yeah, he had a website, but if you looked at his website, they weren't selfies. It was all about Eucharistic miracles. So he ordered his use of technology um, in in a way that was oriented towards God. And we can use these technologies in a way that they are in service to something higher, but we also want to show that these are dangerous, that they can become the masters. These tools can make tools of us because they have an addictive quality. So we want to really be sober-minded and say, what's happening? Let's not just take a naive way and say, yeah, let's just use the internet and evangelize. Well, that's true, but we also need to say, how are these forms impacting us? And what is a really Catholic response to not just the content, but also the medium themselves? And how do we make sure that in this virtual world, we remain tethered to reality? And what are the steps to do that? And Carlo becomes our guide for that.
Tim, there's one last question here. When you were editing, say, Jesus Thirst, What was one word or a phrase? Did something keep coming back to you while you were making this film as
Yeah.
something that grounded you?
Yeah, I think for me and for our editor, I have to give a lot of credit to our team too. Mark Botnian was who edited this film. Just was a masterful editor, and again, Stefan Slovak, as I mentioned, is the co-writer, and the Castletown team, and Jim Wahlberg as well, with just tremendous insights on helping us with different interviews. And I think for me, what kept coming back, and it's the reason why we bookended the film with Fulton Sheen was his sense that um, if we have the eyes of faith, um, that which looks ordinary, that which looks utterly just plain, just as plain as a piece of bread, with the eyes of faith, we see divinity. There's the sense in which faith, which maybe since the Reformation, maybe since the modern era, has become increasingly an intellectual idea. We have a series of concepts that we assent to. There's a truth to that. But more than that, it's a sense of transformed vision that when we can fall on our knees and ask for faith, something happens where God grants us a grace to see reality in an entirely new way. And there's no shortcut there to get there. It's not as if you're first going to figure it out in your head and then all of a sudden, then you fall on your knees. You fall on your knees first, and then this world opens up. So I guess the word was the very last word of the film where Fulton Sheen says, try it. He goes through and says, where did I find power? Where did I find light? Where did I find the beauty of my priesthood? It was here in this encounter with Christ in the Eucharist. In the last words he says in the film, there's try it. So that's, I think, was the orienting principle of the film. We can't convince anybody. You can't strong arm anyone. In all humility, all we can say is there is beauty, there is light, there is goodness, there is truth here, and we want to just show this to you. This is how it's transformed me. This is how it's transformed this community. So try it. That I think was kind of, that's the word that has come back to I think all of us who worked on this film, and what our hope was, what we wanted to convey to audience members.
Tim Moriarty of Castletown Media. He's the director of Jesus Thirst. Tim, thanks for being with me.
Thanks so much, James.